Hey guys, welcome to the first algebra review video for Principles of Engineering. The goal here is to go through some basic algebra skills for those of you that haven't used it in a while or are struggling to deal with some of the calculations in POE. For the first video, we are simply going to go over 4 different concepts in algebraic equations in the format of just the equations themselves, how to utilize them, how to manipulate them to get the variable we are looking for. So we're going to start with one that's very, very simple. Hopefully we won't be going too fast for you, so we're going to start with some basics. Now the equation is going to be 3x is equal to 15. Now for some of you that are good with the mental math, you may be able to figure this out just immediately in your head without even really having to think about it. But I want to make sure you guys know the process of how the solution is derived. So the base idea of algebra is that if you have an equation, okay, if you have an equality, and you do the same thing to both sides of the equation, it will stay equal. Let me say that again. If you have an equality, and you do the same thing to both sides of the equation, it will stay equal. So we are going to try to find x by itself. Now, for the time being, we're going to use x as the variable, and we're not going to worry about where this equation comes from, what it represents, or where anything came from in terms of an equation. We are simply going to work with this equation as is. So, to get x by itself, to solve for x, we're going to do the same thing to both sides of the equation. Now, the big question is, okay, what is it that we're doing to both sides of the equation? Well, if you have 3 times x, 3 is multiplied to x. So to get x by itself, you want to do kind of the opposite of what this says it's doing. So if it's 3 times x, we're going to divide by 3. And what's going to happen is you'll have the 3 canceling, and you end up with x is equal to 15 divided by 3, and that's going to give you an answer of x is equal to 5. Okay? And I'm going to put a box around it just so we can pick it out of the process. Okay, so again, the idea is pretty straightforward. You do the same thing to both sides of the equation to keep it equal. Alright, now the next equation we're going to deal with has a different setup, a different situation, and it's going to be dealing with distribution, distributing values throughout a series of parentheses. So again, this is the equation we're going to deal with. We're not going to worry about where the equation comes from or what x is going to represent. So we're going to start with 4 times a quantity x minus 2 is equal to 12. Now again, we're simply going to solve for the value of x. Now to do that, we need to get rid of those parentheses first. And to do that, we are going to distribute the 4 throughout both parts of the parentheses. So you're going to take the 4, multiply it by the x, and you're going to take the 4 and multiply it by the negative 2. Make sure you keep track of that negative sign. So 4 times x is simply 4x minus 4 times 2 is going to be 8 is equal to 12. Now, to finish this off, we are going to just do the same thing we did in the previous problem. Whatever the value is suggesting we do, we kind of do the opposite. So if this is 4x minus 8, we're going to add 8 to both sides. So we now have 4x is equal to 20. And now since it's 4 times x is equal to 20, again we have to do the same thing to both sides of an equation to keep it equal. And since it's 4 times x, we're going to divide by 4. The 4's cancel to just a 1, so now we have 1x, or just x, is equal to 20 divided by 4, which is 5. So, that is the setup for the second problem. On to number 3. Now the third one, again, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to have a squared function. We're going to have a squared function to continue on. And this one is going to be the equation 2x squared is equal to 18. Okay. This will pop up periodically in some equations in POE, and we'll do some examples of those equations, where those numbers come from, and where these equations actually come from a little bit later. But for right now, we're just going through the general process. So 2 times x squared is equal to 18. Again, we want to get x by itself. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to divide both sides by 2. Since it's 2 times x squared, we're going to divide both sides by 2, and that'll give us x squared is equal to 9. 18 divided by 2 is 9. Now the last part is the square function. So x squared is equal to 9. Now, in the previous problems we had, okay, this one, it was x times 3, so we divided by 3. This was minus 8, so we added 8. We've always done kind of the opposite of what the function suggests. This time we're dealing with an x squared function. Now the opposite of a square is a square root. Okay? And the square root function should appear on your calculator that looks something like that. Okay? Square root function, kind of like the old-fashioned dividing sign with a little hook on the end of it. So that's square root. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. Again, if you do the same thing to both sides of the equation, it stays equal. Now, just like the 4 in the numerator and denominator canceled, the squared and the square root will cancel. So we now have x is equal to, and now we have the square root of 9. Now, if you punch the number into the calculator, square root of 9, you're going to get 3, but one thing the calculator will not always tell you is there are 2 possible solutions. The square root of 9 can be either positive or negative 3, plus or minus 3. Now, how do you know which answer is the correct one? Well, we'll get to that in a little bit more detail when we do some specific examples. But to answer the question simply, it's whatever works in the situation that you're looking at. Okay, whatever works in the situation you're looking at, and that'll make more sense when we are analyzing it. So the general solution in this situation is x is equal to plus or minus 3. Right. And the last example problem we're going to do is going to seem relatively simple in terms of setup, but it's going to be very, very different in terms of how we actually solve it. Now, the last equation we're going to deal with is simply 8 is going to be equal to 104 divided by x. Now, this time we have the x in the denominator. We've not seen that before. Now, there are several ways to solve this. If you have a lot of experience with algebra, you may have one method, but the method that I'd like to work with students on this is a concept that you should have learned at some point, and that is cross multiplication. All right? Now, since we have 8 is equal to 104 over x, hopefully you remember, if you dealt with fractions at any point, 8 just by itself as a value is the same thing as 8 over 1. Now, you're looking at that thinking, okay, what's the big deal? Why is that even a thing? If it means the same thing, why even bother? Well, now we have a fraction equal to another fraction. 8 over 1 is equal to 104 over x. And all of a sudden we have ratios. Now, the best way to solve ratios is cross multiplication. Cross multiplication, hopefully you remember, is you take the top value of this times the bottom value of this. The numerator here times the denominator here is equal to the denominator here times the numerator here. Or, to draw it out, this times this is equal to that times that. That's how you get the term cross multiplication. So I'm simply going to write it out. 8 times x is equal to 104 times 1. Now, realistically, you don't need to write out the 104 times 1 or the multiplication symbol in the middle of this, but I'm doing it just for consistency's sake. So I'm going to simplify it just a little bit. 8x is equal to 104. So now we have it in a format that's a little bit easier to deal with. We're going to divide both sides by 8. And if you punch it in, 104 divided by 8 is going to be 13, so x is going to be equal to 13. All right. So those are the 4 examples. of just some basic algebra skills. Now in the next video we're going to show some examples of where these equations might appear in POE based on some specific equations, based on some specific calculations, and the x's, the unknown variables, will mean something at that point. Alright, thanks guys. We'll see you next time.